Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you today wherever you find yourself scattered, and that you know that his presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. We come to a very unusual place in Paul's writings as we take a look at Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Here we find Paul actually calling out two of his fellow workers in the church at Philippi. He says, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I ask you, loyal yokefellow or true friend, and we don't know if the true friend is a particular person in the church or if he's referring to the church body as a whole. But I ask you, true friend, to help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and all those who have helped me, whose names are written in the book of life. Now, this is really significant on a couple of grounds. One, I want to make sure that we do recognize that here we have two women, Euodia and Syntyche, and Paul identifies them as fellow workers, teammates in the gospel. And so ministry was not just a male thing. It was not men only. Paul identifies these two women as being important laborers, co-laborers in the work of the gospel there at Philippi, along with Clement, along with several others. So that's the first thing we need to make sure, that we recognize that ministry is not just for men, that these women played an important role. But the second thing we need to see, and this is what's so unusual, is that he calls these two fellow workers, these two leaders, out for not being of the same mind of Christ. And so he's saying, I plead with each of you. I plead with Euodia. I plead with Syntyche that you be of the same mind as Christ. Now, Paul will often mention his fellow workers at the close of the letter, at the beginning of the letter, and usually in very positive, glowing terms. We saw how he talked about Timothy. I have no one like him. And he's very concerned about you, and he puts Christ first. We saw the high praise that he had for Epaphroditus, who had risked his life for the cause of the gospel. And so normally when Paul mentions fellow workers by name, it's to praise them, it's to give them some honor. But here he mentions these two ladies, these two fellow workers, and he's pleading with each of them that they be same-minded. And not just that they agree with each other, but they be same-minded in the Lord. And he's asking the true friend, whether that's the church or whether that's a particular individual, to help them. He doesn't want to lose them, and he doesn't want whatever's going on between them to be destructive, to destroy the church at Philippi. And I can't help but wonder if this is what he's been aiming at through the whole letter. I mean, it's just so unusual for him to call somebody out by name. And just imagine your name being called out in the context of church for a bad attitude, for not getting along, for being a rival. And so it's a pretty intense situation that he would call them out. He still sees them as fellow workers. He desires them to be part of the team. He desires them to get along. But he knows that right now they don't have the mind of Christ. And so the call is to each of them to not just agree with each other, but to take on the mind of Christ. And I think back through the letter, Paul talked about how the things that happened to him have actually turned out for the advancement of the gospel. And he knows that others are trying to take advantage of his circumstances. And so they're preaching the gospel out of rivalry, out of envy, trying to stir up trouble for Paul. And Paul says, what does it matter so long as the gospel is proclaimed? Maybe that needs to be the attitude of Euodia and Syntyche. Instead of being concerned about each other's motives, that they simply rejoice that the gospel is being proclaimed. I think about how he emphasizes to be same-minded in Christ and to have the mind of Christ. And Christ didn't regard equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, he humbled himself and let God do the lifting. Again, maybe that's what he's trying to get across to Euodia and Syntyche, that instead of exalting themselves against each other, trying to win an argument or a power struggle or getting things done their way, that they actually empty themselves, humble themselves, and allow Christ to do the lifting rather than exalting themselves against each other. Maybe that's what he's getting at through his whole testimony. All the things he thought were so important become meaningless compared to actually knowing Christ and being conformed to Christ. Again, those words to do everything without grumbling and complaining, those words about how he weeps over those who are enemies of the cross, whose God is their stomach, who simply serve their own desires. I just think of all the different kind of moments in the letter that kind of stand out, and now all of a sudden seeing them through the light of this call out. And maybe this is what he's been building towards all along. These two very important, very dear fellow workers have somehow become rivals of each other. And as rivals of each other, they are no longer operating in the mind of Christ or with the mind of Christ. And so calling them to be same-minded, to have the humility of Christ, and to work together for the cause of the gospel, just as they always have. Well, chewing on that one. Wherever you find yourself scattered today, I think this is the word. Don't fall into a trap of becoming rivals with those or against those that you're actually working with. It's terrible when teammates become rivals, selfish, self-centered rivals. And so Paul is trying to avoid that, trying to eliminate that in the church at Philippi. So wherever you find yourself scattered today, the word is be a good teammate, and especially in terms of having the mind of Christ. God bless. Have a great day.